Hello everybody and welcome to Amplifying Artistry. Musicians, and in particular saxophone players, are constantly searching for their ideal sound and for a way to pursue their unique musical voice. Whether we like to admit it or not, we are all absolute gear nerds. We spend our time searching for equipment that make us feel comfortable and that allows us to produce the sounds that we're hearing in our head. We look to the ideal reed. We look to ligatures, different mouthpieces, different neck screws. But have we considered the saxophone resonator as something that could be involved in shaping our sound and the performability of our instrument? This is what my research has been looking into. In today's lecture, we'll be focusing on the key outcomes from my research inquiry into saxophone pad resonators, with a particular focus on the oversized variant. I would like to use this opportunity to show you what I've been doing for the past 3 years. We'll discuss the methods employed, we'll look at the research outcomes, and we'll explore the performability and player experience of the 4 studied saxophone setups, with a live demonstration and discussion with special guest Jesse Deane. And we will touch on the future and what this might hold for saxophonists, manufacturers, and repair technicians alike. And of course, as Ash said, there will be questions, so please do think about this as we dive into my research, as I'd love to answer any questions you may have when we get to the end of this talk. So your first thought might be, what exactly is a resonator? The resonator is the disc that you can see here in this image that sits in the centre of our saxophone pad. It is situated under the key, and when you close your keys, the resonator now sits within the tone holes inside the instrument. Resonators are made from different materials such as brass, copper, gold, and they come in a variety of shapes: flat, domed, corrugated, teardrop shaped, even shaped as a cone. They can be standard sized and oversized. And there are many opinions on the influence that these shapes, sizes, and materials have, but none of these opinions are supported by objective data. In fact, to this day, only one researcher has provided data to prove the efficacy of the saxophone pad resonator. Pauline Avino and her team have demonstrated that when there is no resonator in the saxophone, it has a negative impact on the sound and playability. They found that when there was no resonator, the leather dampened the sound and made playing uncomfortable. It was concluded that the resonator's primary function was to reflect the sound as it travels down the instrument. And now, while Avino's research has laid a great foundation in understanding the resonator's role as it reflects the sound down the instrument, there is still a large gap in this area of research. The material impact on tone and timbre is unexplored. The playing impacts of the resonator requires further investigation, and the size of the resonator, specifically the oversized, is yet to be explored. Now, I clicked this a little early, sorry about that. When the saxophone was invented in 1846, there were no resonators. Over time, players found that the leather billowed and impeded the tone space. So a stitch in the middle was added to compensate for this before the experimentation of rivets to stop the drooping of the leather. In 1921, Bisher invented the first resonator, the snap-on button. This is the first instance that the manufacturer claimed tonal improvement due to the resonator. Bisher claimed that the snap-on buttons provided sonic resonance and mitigated the changes in the leather. This snap-on system was also beneficial to musicians, as they could take a pad off the instrument and replace it quickly on a gig without the aid of a repair technician. In 1938, Eugene Sander created the padless saxophone, with the claim of twice the volume and 120% more air tightness. It had greater resonance, brilliance of tone, desirable overtones, and improved articulation between notes. However, due to World War II, production was abandoned and only 1,000 were ever made. But this was the first experimentation akin to oversized resonators. During the 1940s and 50s, Selmer brought out their domed Tonex resonators. Throughout this period, they changed from metal to plastic, which can be seen in their Mark VI range of saxophones. And this change to plastic was due to lighter key action and eliminating rust. They also claimed that there was no tonal difference between the two materials. In 1960s, Buffet, in their Dynaction series of saxophones, developed a similar resonator system to the Bisher Snap-on with a screw-on resonator. These were very large in comparison to the resonators up to this point and can be considered oversized. And this brings us to the present day. Today, when you buy a factory-made saxophone, all the instruments are equipped with standard size resonators. So Yamaha, Selmer, Reference 54s and Jupiter saxophones all have standard plastic resonators, whereas Yanagisawa, Carworth and the Selmer Series 2 and 3 include standard metal, for example. The oversized resonators are now only an aftermarket purchase. A resonator is considered oversized when there is a gap of between 2mm and 0.8mm from the resonator edge to the internal tone hole edge. The oversized resonator can cover up to 64% more surface area than the standard size option available today. And looking at this slide, these are the 4 different resonator setups that I used in my research. I'd like to introduce you to this guy, Ernest Ferrin. He was a highly regarded French technician and author of The Saxophone Is My Voice. He believed that the ideal resonator was the oversized resonator. He said they were more free-blowing and permitted the full spectra of harmonics to be available, allowing for increased sound manipulation. He stated, players can always remove harmonics due to changes in their equipment and the way that they manipulate their vocal tract, but they cannot add harmonics that don't exist in the sound. But without evidence to support his claim that the oversized variant was the ideal resonator, I wanted to know, was bigger better? Considering Ernest Ferrin's belief that the ideal resonator is the oversized variant, and given the lack of research on its effects, saxophonists looking for specific tonal qualities face a challenge in making informed decisions when choosing new resonators. Therefore, my aim was to delve into the realm of oversized resonators and offer objective insights on their impact on the saxophone's timbre, resonance, and playability. To answer my research goals, 2 methodologies were employed. Methodology 1 was a super-controlled science experiment that gathered quantitative data on the saxophone's harmonic response between the different resonator setups, free from human interaction. And methodology 2 was developed to gather qualitative data to better understand the experience of the saxophone players as they played one resonator setup to another. Could they feel and hear a difference? And can we quantify this? Let's delve into these methodologies in more detail. To achieve the research goals, I needed 4 saxophones with differing resonator setups. I had 4 identical Yamaha saxophones. 1 saxophone was kept in its original form and was not used in methodology 1. This saxophone had standard-sized plastic resonators that normally come with Yamaha saxophones. The 2nd saxophone was altered to oversized plastic resonators. The 3rd saxophone was altered to standard metal. And the final saxophone was altered to oversized metal, as you previously saw before. The idea behind methodology 1 was to create a super-controlled environment to undertake an experiment that measured the frequency response of the saxophones before and after the resonators had changed. I was then able to compare the frequency response of the instrument, knowing that only the resonator had changed. Therefore, I would be able to definitively say whether the resonator contributed to a change in harmonic makeup or not. And when talking about harmonic makeup or frequency response, I'm referring to where the harmonics are distributed. So a tone that is bright, for example, has more upper harmonics or higher frequencies present in the tone, and a dark sound in contrast has greater response in the lower harmonics. So by looking at the harmonic response, I could see how the resonator impacted the tone and timbre of the instrument. To measure the frequency response on the saxophone, a device was created to gather objective data without human interaction. I've called this device the saxophone driver. The saxophone driver was situated over the mouthpiece where the reed would normally be, and there were 2 microphones. One was at the bell and the other was inside the saxophone driver. Continuing to look inside the driver, there was a loudspeaker that was connected to an amplifier and a filter box. The saxophone driver was also connected to a CPAP machine, which allowed air to travel down the instrument. And this also provided us with humidity and temperature control. Finally, the saxophone driver was connected to an oscilloscope. And this oscilloscope was able to generate a sine tone that went projected through the saxophone driver. It would sweep from 100 Hz to 2 kHz in what's called a bowed plot. And with this measurement, the bowed plot would allow us to visualise the harmonic response of the saxophone. So I did this before the resonators were changed and after the resonators were changed, and compared the before and after bowed plots. I also measured the instruments with pure sine tone comparison, where the saxophone driver would generate, for example, 440 Hz, which is equivalent to our alto saxophone F sharp, and the fingering was set for this pitch. The difference with this measurement was that the tone was not sweeping. I did this measurement with the saxophone driver and with my own playing examples to again compare the harmonic response before and after the resonator change, and to see if the saxophone driver and my playing examples matched up. Now, I appreciate that there's a lot here to try and visualise, so I've created a video where you can see a snippet of the saxophone driver in action with a little bit of assistance from my stage self. Please enjoy. We are listening to the saxophone driver that is projecting a sound down the instrument, and it is doing a bowed plot, which is where it will start at about 200 Hz and will go all the way up to 2 kHz. And what we'll be able to see is the harmonic response of the saxophone, which you can see here. The peaks on the oscilloscope can show us where the resonance peaks are for the instrument, and then from there we can see how there's been a change from one setup to another. So when the resonators have changed, we then get to compare the graphs and see what has happened. So methodology 1 was very important because with the assistance of the saxophone driver, I was then able to provide objective data on both the resonator's impact on timbre and resonance, covering 2 out of my 3 research goals. The final goal was to discover whether the resonator played a role in the playability of the saxophone, and what does that mean for us as saxophonists? Could musicians feel and hear a difference between the 4 resonator setups, and was there a resonator that was favoured over the others, and why? To answer these, methodology 2 was developed. A blind study measured 50 local professional saxophonists who were all invited to play the 4 different saxophones. During the study, the musicians were unaware of the specific resonator setups they were playing to remove bias. The participants were asked to play a variety of musical excerpts, exercises, and also allowed free play on the instruments. They then provided feedback by answering survey questions relating to their experiences. These survey questions were set up in a typical Likert scale numbered from 0 to 7, 0 being strongly disagree and 7 being strongly agree. And by doing so, I could turn these answers into statistics and see if there were any trends among the participants. The survey encompassed various playing aspects including evenness, ease of expression, dynamic control, articulation, opinions on resonance, tonal colour and timbre, overall comfort, and whether the musicians could feel and hear a difference between the 4 different resonator setups. Of course, there was also room to find out their preference and why. Now, I guess you're all dying to know what are the results. However, before I share these with you, I'd like to introduce my good friend and special guest for today's lecture, Jesse Deane, who will demonstrate the 4 different saxophones from my research. We'll get to hear Jesse compare the 2 plastic resonator variants, and we'll also hear a comparison of the 2 metal variants. Jesse and I will discuss what he is feeling, and I will intertwine my research results around Jesse's demonstration and discussion of the different saxophone setups. So please welcome Jesse Deane to the stage. Jesse's now going to play the saxophone fitted with standard plastic resonators as per Yamaha's standard issue. Jesse's going to play several musical excerpts that have been taken from the blind study, and he will play the same excerpts when he changes saxophone so that you can hear a direct comparison. Jesse will play saxophone 1, and then I will talk you all through this graph behind us as Jesse swaps to saxophone 2. Jesse will then demonstrate saxophone 2, and then we'll have a discussion and see how Jesse found the two resonator setups. So, feeling good, Jesse?
Yep, let's do it.
All right, let's hear the saxophone with standard plastic resonators. Thanks, Jesse. So the saxophone Jesse has just demonstrated is represented in white on the spectrum analyzer graph behind us here. This is one of the results from methodology 1, where a single tone was recorded and compared before and after the resonators were changed. This is a low B flat note on the alto saxophone and shows the overall shape to the tone. On the spectrum analyzer graph, the y-axis, top to bottom here, measures amplitude in decibels or how loud, and the x-axis down the bottom here is measured in frequency or hertz, so the pitch. To read this graph, put simply, we can think of the graph in thirds. So on the left third here, this is our bottom end to the tone. In the middle third, this is the mids of our tone, and in the top third, this is the top of our tone. And the higher the frequency curve, so this way, the more present or resonant that section of harmonics are within the sound. This frequency curve of standard plastic resonators shows that the saxophone is very resonant in the bottom and mid-range of the tone and tapers off in the upper harmonics. The curve is very smooth, indicating an even tone. And now we're going to hear Jesse play the oversized plastic saxophone, and this is represented in blue on the frequency curve behind us. And then we'll have a chat. All right, Jesse, when you're ready. Thanks, Jesse.
No worries.
Now, how did you find that the different saxophones compared from one to another in terms of playability?
I guess the biggest difference is number one felt a bit more easy blowing, more free blowing, and number two I felt there was a darker, rounder tone quality
Yeah.
that I could get out of it.
And so you said that number 1 was free blowing. Does that mean that number 2 was not free blowing?
It's still free blowing, not as free blowing. I felt there was a little bit more for me to push against in the airstream, and I could use that to change my tone color.
Yeah, okay. So have you, so you did experience a tonal change between number 1 and number 2 as well?
Absolutely. I felt like I could do a lot more with number 2.
Yeah, okay. And you said that there was a resistance for number 2, and that's a positive. Does that mean it was the free blowingness you found difficult in number 1, or that they were both easy still?
It was still easy to play number 1. It's just I felt number 2 gave me more possibilities with my tone color, more things I could do with it.
Yeah, and I also heard, I don't know if you guys heard this as well, that you projected a little bit more on the saxophone too. And was that because, like you were saying, you could push against the instrument more?
Yeah, it felt safer to play louder and push against it, yeah.
So it seems like you might have a favourite out of the 2.
Yeah, number 2 so far, yep.
Okay. All right, Jesse, thank you so much. So I'm sure you could hear, as we just discussed, that when Jesse played saxophone 2 with oversized plastic resonators, there was a tonal difference between the 2 plastic resonator setups. And looking at the blue frequency curve behind us, you can see that the oversized plastic resonators exhibited a diminished response in the lower and mid harmonics, while showing a more pronounced response in the upper harmonics. And this shape should suggest a darker tone, but with a pointed quality to the sound. And as Jesse explained, they both felt different for varying reasons. And this result was also found among all the blind study participants. To summarise the qualities of the plastic resonators, I created a playing attributes matrix that brought the findings from both methodologies together. Now, when you look at the matrix, the sections that are marked with an asterisk are results that end up being statistically significant. That means that if the study was repeated, these answers are highly likely to come back as the same result. When looking at the playing attributes of oversized plastic resonators, the attributes that caused a lot of division amongst the participants were the resistant playing quality and tonal colour. Some people loved the resistance and sound, but others absolutely hated it, to be fair. It was quite a divisive topic. And these attributes were clearly exaggerated by the oversized nature of the resonator. Now, to stick with the matrix for a second, you can also see the word woody to describe oversized plastic resonators. Now, in fact, multiple participants referred to this saxophone in this way, and some players even described the oversized plastic resonators as being clarinet-like. So with this feedback, it was irresistible to not explore the comparison of this saxophone to a clarinet. So I conducted a brief ad hoc experiment where I played the clarinet into the spectral analyzer software and compared it to the oversized plastic resonator saxophone. Now, on the left here, you can see the original standard plastic resonators, and on the right, this is the oversized resonator. So standard plastic here, oversized here, or, as you just heard Jesse, number 1 and number 2. And this Snell graph also gives us another way of visualising the harmonic spectrum of the 2 plastic setups. And you can see that the harmonics, which are written in pictures, are distributed differently between the left and the right. Now, when we compare this to a clarinet, let's see what happens. The graph on the left is an equivalent note for the alto saxophone low D, but performed on the clarinet. For ease of visual representation, the transposition of the Snell was left in alto transposition so that we could see the oversized plastic resonators and the clarinet are very similar. Let's have a look one more time. Going back to what it was and what it became. What is particularly unusual about this is that the clarinet is a straight bore instrument and only produces odd harmonics. And by comparison, the saxophone is a conical bore instrument and produces both even and odd harmonics. So the oversized plastic resonator results have shown that the resonators have distributed most of the even harmonics to odd harmonics, similar to a clarinet. Therefore, players who are searching for a more unique sound may wish to explore oversized plastic resonators. Alrighty, on to the metal resonators. Jesse's now going to play the standard metal resonators, which you can see on the spectral graph behind us in white. All right, Jesse, feeling good?
Yep.
All right, when you're ready. Okay. How did you find playing this saxophone, Jesse?
This one, in comparison, is closer to number one, but very free blowing, very responsive. I found articulation a bit easier.
Yeah.
Which was useful in
Would you
Moose the
say
Mooch.
easier? Because I heard this too when you were playing Moose the Mooch, that it had like a bit more of a point to it.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by easier? So you could push out like accents and stuff more?
Yeah, absolutely, and project a bit more as well, yeah.
How did you find the tone compared to the other two saxophones?
I didn't find that I could do as much with it in the classical one as number two. Yeah, closer to number one, a bit brighter.
Yeah, and when you mean you couldn't do as much with it, are you talking expression or tone-wise?
Expression with my tone in the classical one, yeah.
Okay, so for what you were hearing, you've got some alliances
Yeah.
at saxophone 2 at the moment.
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
And I heard when you did your arpeggios on this one that it was probably the smoothest out of the three so far. Did you notice a difference there?
It felt like really quick. It felt like really quick response from the instrument when I went for low notes.
Yeah.
Like I was getting feedback straight away that it was going to work.
Okay, great. And how was you said it was like saxophone 1. Do you mean in terms of it didn't have resistance like saxophone 2?
Yeah,
so
freer blowing.
More free blowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. And one more question. How did you find the expressive devices on this saxophone? Like when you were doing vibrato, I could really hear that from here, and I'm on the side of you.
Yeah, it was easy to do vibrato. I could get the projection. I felt I didn't have as much to push against for the volumes. I didn't feel as safe, maybe.
Okay, all right.
But I could do it, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jesse. So the saxophone shape behind us tells us that the saxophone had a strong fundamental in the bottom, so just here, but a diminished response in the mid-range and a strong presence in the upper harmonics, especially when it was compared to the plastic resonators. Now, I'm going to get Jesse to play the oversized metal saxophone, and this saxophone is represented here in the blue frequency curve. Okay, thank you, Jesse. Let's compare this one that you've just played, so oversized metal, with the standard metal for a second. How did they feel in comparison to one another?
I felt like I got a lot of projection and free blowing for both. I felt like I could do a bit more with my tone in the lower region with this one.
Yep.
Compared to the standard metal, number 3, yeah.
And is that because it's maybe more similar to the sound that you're wanting?
I think
with
so.
like Saxophone 2 is offering? Because I had noticed that too. It had maybe a bit of a sweetness to the sound.
Yeah, it's closer to 2 in that regard.
Yeah, okay. And how did it feel from a free blowingness or resistance point of view?
Still pretty free blowing, not quite as much as number 3.
Yep.
But maybe slightly more than number 2.
Okay. And I noticed the articulation was a little bit different between the two. Were you having to adjust stuff as you were playing, especially with smooth?
Number 3 was still the easiest I've had articulation on. This one was getting closer to number 2 again.
Okay. And if you were to compare it to the plastic ones, how are you finding the oversized metal versus the plastic?
I still enjoyed number 2 the most for tone.
Okay. So I was going to ask you that if you had a preference out of the 4.
Still number 2 for what I want to do, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Jesse. So the oversized metal saxophone ended up having more presence in the bottom and mid-range of the tone compared to the standard-sized metal. And although that you can see an even greater presence in the upper harmonics, this saxophone was considered bright, but with a dark undertone, as you just heard when Jesse played. The 2 metal variants of saxophones ended up being very popular among the blind study participants. They were both considered very easy to play, as Jesse mentioned, and some intriguing and significant playing outcomes emerged. As we just mentioned, both saxophones ended up being brighter in tone than the plastic resonators, but the timbre was considered similar between the 2 metal saxophones. The main difference was attributed to the increased mid and lower frequencies of the oversized metal resonators. Now, although the metal timbres did have similarities, there was still a statistically significant outcome that all participants classified the 4 different resonator setups as having a different timbre from one to another, which is pretty exciting. A talking point amongst the metal saxophonists was the free blowing category of the oversized resonators. In the opposite direction to oversized plastic, the oversized metal resonators ended up being statistically significant as being the most free-blowing saxophone. This was a positive attribute for some players, but it was also a negative for others. And as Jesse has mentioned, he likes the resistance of oversized plastic, and so the free-blowing nature can be considered difficult to tame. However, in other people's eyes, it's considered the dream saxophone due to its free-blowing nature. I'd also like to mention the vibrato section of this matrix. This was a fascinating outcome in that one saxophone showed statistical significance as being the most expressive instrument, in that it was effortless to produce expressive devices such as vibrato and articulation. During the blind study, I received results for many specific playing attributes, so what you're seeing in this matrix is a summary of all the considered attributes researched. For example, I looked at articulation, dynamics, the starts of notes, projection of sound, and they've all been summarised here. But when looking at the entire collection of playing attributes, saxophone 3, with the standard metal resonators, came out on top in almost every category. It was considered the most flexible out of all of the saxophones. And I attribute this to a phenomenon that only came about in the standard metal resonators. The saxophone with standard metal resonators had an amplified presence of the first harmonic peak. And that's here, right here. So this is your first harmonic peak, and we're looking at the blue one. Why this is significant is that there is research that has shed light on the tendency for the low register notes on the saxophone to exhibit a stronger second or third harmonic relative to the first or fundamental harmonic. And this imbalance contributes to increased impedance and makes the lower notes more challenging to control. So when you hear a saxophonist trying to play their low register notes, sometimes you'll hear the octave or the fifth coming out instead of that low note that they're aiming for. And this is due to this harmonic imbalance, where the second and third peaks are more dominant in the harmonic makeup of the note. However, in the standard metal resonators, there was a departure from this pattern. The first harmonic peak was more pronounced than the second and third harmonic peaks. So you can also compare that here, that this is the oversized metal, this is the first peak, and it is increased here. You can see that second peak. Here is the standard metal, it is more present than these two. And this change was only noticed in the standard metal resonators. And with the addition of higher harmonics present in the sound, this saxophone was classed as the most flexible out of all 4 different resonator setups, as it offered ease of low register notes with a full spectrum of harmonics available to the performer. Now, although the standard metal resonators were considered the most flexible, players tended to select their preferred saxophone based on tone, resonance, and their preference for resistance or no resistance. And saxophone 4 with oversized metal resonators ended up being the overall preferred saxophone at the end of the study. There were 16 participants, or 32%, that favoured it, and many of whom selected it for its versatility. So you can see it was selected by classical, cross-genre, and jazz saxophonists. However, it's important to note that the results were very close, showing a clear divide among participants for overall preference. I'll just give you a minute to have a look at that. All right. In the controlled environment of methodology 1, the 2 plastic resonators were considered the most resonant saxophones. In contrast, in the blind study, the metal resonators were considered the most resonant. It's important to note that each of the methodologies took place in different environments, and these results may have been impacted by the room acoustics, as resonance is a result of vibrations in space. But when all participants were asked to define resonance, a variety of answers occurred. For some, resonance was richness in fundamental harmonics, and for others, it was having a brightness to the tone or a full spectrum of harmonics. So with that in mind, the metal resonators exhibited higher harmonics compared to the plastic resonators. And to the musician, this full spectrum of harmonics, as Ernest Ferrin claimed, made the musicians perceive these instruments as more resonant than the plastic setups. As I dove into the depths of my research, it became evident that the resonators were contributing to the sound and overall playability of the saxophones. I began to wonder what the future might hold. Firstly, with the assistance of the saxophone driver, we can test other parts of our instrument, such as the material the saxophone is made out of, or the material the pads are made from, or different necks, other customisable features. And given the differing preferences of the participants, and in some cases very passionate opposing views, I thought we should look back to our resonator history and consider the first ever saxophone resonator with the Bisher snap-on buttons. Today's saxophone pads and resonators are together, with the technician installing or replacing them as one unit. However, in Bisher's saxophone, the resonator stays with the saxophone. Could we then have a saxophone that allows the musician to choose what resonators they have at any given time? If this design came back, but with multiple sets of resonators, the player could choose their sound and feel based on what genre they are playing or what playing attributes they wanted to focus on. And given that the room acoustics impact the resonance of the saxophone, if the performer could choose their resonator size and material, they could be their most resonant self in any environment. And as I pondered this, little did I know that across the other side of the world, another repair technician was thinking along the same lines as me. UK repair technician Eddie Ashton has designed a prototype saxophone with an interchangeable resonator system, as well as an alternate option for the saxophone pads themselves. These pads are labelled super pads and have been a product that Eddie has used in clarinets for many years, but only just started experimenting with them on the saxophone. So I have with me today a prototype of what the future might hold. This is a saxophone with a synthetic pad and a magnetic resonator system. One difference with this saxophone is that not all of the pads have a resonator, so the ones that are small are missing resonators on this saxophone. For example, like your palm keys, they do not have resonators on this saxophone. Nonetheless, it only takes 10 minutes to swap all the resonators out, And on this saxophone, they're all standard sized. I tested this saxophone with the saxophone driver, and the results are exciting. This bode plot shows the before and after repadding of the superpad saxophone, and you can see the sheer difference the saxophone pad has had on the harmonic spectra of the instrument, suggesting that the saxophone pad also plays a significant role in the tone, timbre, resonance, and harmonic response of the saxophone. But have the pads also changed the playability of the saxophone? Jesse will now demonstrate this, and we'll see what he thinks. Thanks, Jesse. Now, how did you find the superpad saxophone? It's currently got metal resonators in it.
Yeah, it felt the closest to number 2 so far.
Okay.
I felt like I had a warmer, darker tone to work with.
Yep.
It felt just very different, the key work.
Under the fingers?
Yeah, under the fingers.
And is that because the pads being different?
Yeah, I think that.
Has that made a difference in how you're, like, you feel comfortable, or like how you feel?
Yeah, I feel really comfortable. So it's changed my perception of
Yep.
how I'm playing, I think, as well.
Okay. And you said it was similar to saxophone 2 with the oversized plastic resonators.
Yeah.
Are you saying that, like, that's in tone or also playability?
Tone and playability. There's a bit more resistance and
Yep.
yeah.
How do you find it compares to the metal saxophones?
Less free blowing, I'd say, maybe a little bit more resistance.
Yep.
I found articulating a bit easier on number 3 and 4, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you sounded great. You've sounded great on all of the saxophones,
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And if you had the choice, would you want a saxophone that had an interchangeable resonator system?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd take 2 for classical, I'd take 3 for everything else, and yep.
Brilliant.
It's a lot cheaper than having 2.
Exactly. All right, well, thank you so much, Jesse.
No worries, thank you.
So, considering the outcomes of this research, I'm excited to have been able to provide musicians with objective information on the saxophone resonator, with particular emphasis on the oversized variant. When the musicians were asked to compare the saxophones in the blind study, there was a unanimous result to the question, can you feel a difference? And the answer was yes. So it is important for players to consider the physical effect that the resonator has on their saxophone performance. It can be concluded that the oversized variant for both metal and plastic gave the most extreme playing attributes. However, we can't say that for everyone, bigger is better, because every resonator setup was a favourite for certain musicians in the study. I'd also like to comment that the musicians who formed a strong opinion on tonal improvement, like Jesse, were willing to forgo certain playing attributes such as ease of articulation and dynamic control for the resultant tonal quality, as they were closer to achieving their desired musical voice. So this research can inform saxophonists who want to consider customising their instruments in pursuit to achieve their ideal sound, as it is evident that resonators influence the timbre, resonance and playability of the saxophone, And you could say the resonator amplifies the artist within. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Erin. And I would like to keep the questions off with a question for you. Are there recommendations that you might be able to make to manufacturers for being able to set up instruments in a particular way for particular artists? So I'm even thinking about beginner artists who might be looking for the ability to find producing the bottom end of the instrument in a really easy way, or jazz artists who have their own characteristics they're looking for. Could you give us some ideas how you might take your research to a manufacturer?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say this, because Saxophone 1 with standard plastic resonators was statistically significant as being the easiest to play down low. So they have it right. It's going to be easy for a student to play this saxophone. It's very comfortable, as Jesse said, free blowing, and maybe a student with other overtones and whatnot, they don't know what to do with it at that level. So it's okay that what they have is they're producing a saxophone that's very comfortable for a student to play anyway. But if you do know that a student wants to play like something like jazz, for example, they might feel like they're not able to cut through in a big band, for example, in terms of like their dynamic projection or articulation. So if they had a metal variant offered to their students, especially someone who wants to play jazz, they're going to be able to cut through that big band a lot easier, and that student will feel more comfortable. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's great. Beautiful. Thank you. Let's open it up to the floor. So does anyone have any questions for Erin on her research?
All the saxophones the same?
All the saxophones are the same, yeah. So when I mentioned this, so they are all Yamaha saxophones, but they are the intermediate model, so Yamaha YAS 480. And when we actually selected the saxophones, we had 6 of them. And that doesn't include saxophone 5. We had 6 at the beginning, and we chose 4 that had an identical harmonic makeup. So there were actually 2 out of the 6 that were quite different. So they were a little bit darker in sound, and with a blind study, even myself, I could hear that just in terms of the tonal quality. And then we checked that with the saxophone driver as well, and it showed that 2 of them were dark, so we didn't use them in the study. Instead, we picked the 4 that were absolutely identical in harmonic spectra before we changed the instruments. Does that answer your question?
And I also noticed that Jesse's using the one neck
Yes.
for this as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we wanted, especially for the blind study, we've changed the neck to be a professional neck. So this is the V1 Yamaha neck. What comes with the YAS 480 is good, but as we all know, I've said this, we're gear nerds, we know that the neck makes a big difference as well. So I've changed it to the professional V1, which has a open bore. It's more comfortable for a professional playing these saxophones. And that way you could just change only one variable. You're just moving it from one to the other. They don't need to move their mouthpiece so that the tuning stays the same. So they could really be quite critical how one felt to the other by keeping that the same.
Cool. Another question for the floor, Mia.
So obviously you're probably looking at this catering towards more professional artists. Do you think a professional horn, being made different materials, all that stuff, do you think that would amplify the differences between the resonators, or do you think the differences would stay roughly the same?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it would be a more obvious difference?
Yeah, I think for example, if we're talking, I don't know, the oversized metal or the oversized plastic, which has made the playing, the feel of the instrument more extreme, I think the feel will stay exactly the same. But I do believe that the tonal change would change, and it might actually go too far the other way. Do you know what I mean? So the manufacturers will be setting this up specifically for that in mind. But what I mean, when we have this interchangeable resonator system, a player might not like what's in their instrument, and they might not realise that what's in there is actually impeding their playing style. So if they had, for example, I don't know, if you had a copper instrument that is a little bit darker, that's what's typically out there, and you added the oversized metal or the standard metal, maybe that makes it a bit brighter and they don't actually want that. So I think that needs to be considered as well. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Another question from the floor? Oh, just up the back here? Yeah.
So did you find the different resonator groups that there was an impact on voicing or extended techniques on each of those instruments?
Yes, definitely. And the players who experimented with overtones found a difference between where the harmonics sat. And I think if you remember back to the plastic image, the oversize was quite erratic is probably a way to describe it. And so this is what I mean by when a player is forgoing ease of play for this tone, though the oversized plastic typically was harder to control the overtones because there was just so much going on with the sound, and it performed in a different way than you would expect. But I do think a player who spends time, as you do with any instrument, they find out what those intricacies are anyway, and if they're able to get the sound that they want, a player will find out what they need to do to make that sax work for them because they're hearing what they want to hear in their head and they're happy, Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
Would you say in that case where you said it's erratic, that it's a more complex sound because it is erratic?
Definitely, yeah.
Right.
And it's got this, when you hear saxophone too, it's got this earthy bottom end and quite a bright top end, which is unusual that they're so spaced from one another.
Yeah.
But players who want that complexity, like Jesse said, he felt like he could do more with that by having these options available. And as Ernest Farron said, a player can always remove harmonics, but they can't add inexistent harmonics. So you can find ways to manipulate the sound, but if they're not in there, so these higher harmonics, if they're not in there, then you can't actually achieve that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought.
Yeah.
Another question, Ray.
Congratulations on a lovely presentation and really interesting topic.
Thank you.
With the 50 players, did they use their own mouthpieces?
Yes, they did. And
in which case they would have brought a whole range of mouthpieces and characteristics.
Correct.
How do you think that has changed the result?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. The heat map that I had before was a heat map that showed the differing mouthpieces that people use, so classical, jazz, and whatnot. And what I found really interesting is whatever style the player played in, so if they're, like Jesse's a classical predominantly player, he will say that saxophone 2, because he loved it, is for classical playing. However, then we had a jazz player come in and they will go, oh yeah, it's my saxophone 2, that's for jazz, because they've made a connection to it and they resonate with that themselves. So they were the results that we found, that it was more about the player comfort, and they needed to be comfortable because a mouthpiece is so personal. You spend ages finding the right mouthpiece, that then they could really articulate what they were feeling compared to their own instrument and from one to the other. But I did find that really quite interesting, that the instruments were put in different categories based on what the players' experience themselves had. Does that help answer your question, Ryan?
Thank you.
Yeah.
What are some of the generalisations you could make about feel versus sound?
Yeah.
Having gone through this experiment, is there any thoughts on that?
I would say the biggest thing for me, especially when I play the 4 different saxophones from the research, is they feel completely different. And so, like Jesse was saying, saxophone 1 was free blowing, saxophone 2 was quite resistant, 3 was very flexible, whatnot. And yes, there are tonal differences, but I found the playing style of each of the saxophone made me be able to play in certain ways as well. So by me feeling comfortable, or having, like Jesse said, the resistance to push against that he liked, he could then also achieve the tone that he wanted as well. So I think they're really quite linked.
Yeah, cool.
So Erin, you've lived with these saxophones for 2 years.
Yeah.
Which is your favourite?
My favourite is actually the same as Jesse's. It's saxophone 2. And for the reason that it's a tone that I can't produce myself. I'm a very bright player, and when I play on that saxophone, I just feel like everything that I've been trying to get is in that saxophone, and I don't need to do anything, it's just there for me. But I would love a future where I could choose what I want in it, because I also love number 4, which is the oversized metal. If I play that in a big band, I feel like on top of the world. I can do whatever I want. I can project, I can have a lovely sound. So I'm a big advocate for let's get this future happening and have the choice for ourselves, you know.
We've probably got time for just one more. Let's see if you don't hear it.
I was just wondering the history of the resonators. That changed when Selma brought in their first plastic resonator.
Yep.
Was that the first plastic resonator?
Correct.
And before that, the con reso was metal?
Yep, so that was a flat metal washer, so I didn't talk about that for time. That was the first instance where we saw a flat resonator, but their main innovation with that pad was that there was a metal ring around the outside of the pad that kept the leather taut. So their main function was to try and stop this billowing at that point in time. And it wasn't until we had Selma that they brought out that first plastic resonator. Yeah. Yeah.
And just to wrap up with, given that the results are quite significant and obviously of great interest to lots of saxophone players,
yeah.
Where do you intend to take your research to try and get some action on this?
I also repair instruments myself, so my plan is to get a Bisher saxophone, get a buffet saxophone and start making interchangeable resonators and start prototyping myself, a bit like what Eddie does, but I'd like to experiment with oversized and standard sized and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, great, excellent. Erin, we've just hit time, so we should leave it there, but thank you everyone for being part of the discussion, and also a huge thank you to Erin and Jesse for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, and I'd just like to thank Ash, Alan, Jesse and all of you for being here today. Thank you so much for being with me on this journey. I really appreciate all of you, and especially Jesse, Alan, Ashley and my lovely husband Alex. Thank you so much, everybody.